The British considered studying the Bantu religion and the culture of the Africans in general in East Africa as very difficult, but they thought it was as important as studying your enemy, the psychology of your enemy. And those are the exact words that CW Hobley uses when he's introducing his book, The Bantu Beliefs and Magic, which is a very interesting book, a book that was published in 1922, a book that describes the religion of the Agikuyu and their Akampa with a lot of detail, and it's very interesting. And I've said in another video, they needed to study these groups because it was important to know how to take away that religion from them or that system from them so that it is easier to control them. And that's actually what happened. Now, in this video, I'm going to read an introduction part of the book where he talks about understanding the psychology of the enemy and actually how that was the same thing as trying to understand the Bantu religion and the culture of the Africans in general. We are going to read this preface of the book, and I need to point out that I've read this book before and I've created several videos out of this book, but owing to how people found it to be so interesting, I've decided to redo it again and create even more videos from it, and we are starting from the start. As you can see, we are starting with the preface in this video, and then we are going to go through the entire book, picking very interesting ideas. I suggest that you get the book and read it yourself. Now, let's read and see what he says about the importance of studying the African religion. This is what he writes in the preface. It is often said that the longer one knows the native, the less one knows, and the less one understands him. So it seems like in the 1920s or maybe 1910s, there was this general understanding among the British officers, especially in East Africa, that the more you try to understand the African, the more difficult it became for you to understand them. There was something about the African that was difficult to figure out. It seemed that the African was so complex, and that's what you get when you read some of these books, including a book by Sir Charles Eliot. In fact, he talks about, there is a place where he mentions that I think that is so difficult to understand the African society, their psychology, their culture, their way of life, their religion, very complex. He continues, this expression is doubtless comforting to persons who have not the patience to systematically study him and his views on life, but it could with convenience be replaced by a saying to the effect that the more one knows of the native, the more one realizes how much remains to be learned. So for Hobley, personally, did not think it was a good idea to give up. That, yeah, the more you learn, the more you realize that it was like an onion. You're peeling it and then there's another layer and another layer. But he said it was worth it to do it. He continues, the spirit of this is in accordance with the true attitude to all other branches of knowledge. For the more one learns, the more the map unfolds, and one gradually realizes the vastness of the country to be explored. During the long years of service in East Africa, my work has brought me into close contact with the native tribes from the Lake Victoria to the coast, and I early realized their administration could not be intelligently conducted without any close inquiry into their social organization and religious beliefs. So he believed that for the British to be effective in administering or ruling over the Africans, it was so important to understand their religion, their way of life, and their customs. Then he writes, it has long been the fashion to look upon such research as being of only academic value. This view, however, is year by year becoming dimmer, and I will ask all those who are interested in Africa to abandon it. So it's like there are those who looked at studying the African, their religion and things like that, as just a matter of academic adventure. But he's like, no, 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 it's not academic adventure, because he realized, he was one of the earliest British administrators to realize that there needed to be a thorough research and study of the people if we are going to change their way of life and to take away their religion and their culture and their constitutions. And he likes to use the word constitution in that regard and give them a new way, a new framework. He continues, the late war has forcibly demonstrated the importance of understanding the psychology of our enemies, and if that is admitted, I would claim that it is as quite important for workers in Africa to endeavor to understand the psychology of the Africans whose friendship is of vital necessity to all progress in that country. Now, here he makes a very interesting point. And when he talks about the late war, he's talking about the First World War. Now, during the First World War, seems like it is probably, and I doubt it is, but that seems like it's the point he's making, that it is during that war that it became very important that you need to study the psychology of your enemy. You need to understand how they think, how they are motivated, and things like that, so that you have strategies in place, of course, to defeat them in that regard. But he says that as it was important to study the psychology of their enemies, the enemies of Britain during the First World War, it was equally as important to study the psychology of the Africans. So that says a lot, even though it does not use the word enemy to describe the Africans, but the fact that he says how it was important to study the psychology of the enemies of Britain during the First World War, it was equally important to study the psychology of Africa. That says it was important to study the psychology of the African for what use, though? For the use of overcoming them, just like they needed that to overcome their enemies during the First World War. So even though the British considered, and we are using Hobley as a representative of the British establishment, and he was, of course, he came to Kenya in 1890 to work for the Imperial British East Africa. And then when the Imperial British East Africa, of course, handed over the protectorate to the British government, the colonial office, he joined the civil service. He became a district commissioner and then a provisional commissioner. There was even a time when he acted as the overall commissioner of the protectorate for, I think, maybe a month or two. So he was a very senior official, and he stayed around for close to 30 years. And even the people who were senior than him in the colony often would seek him out for advice, especially when they needed to understand what to do about the people, because they came to see him as somebody who had taken the time to study the African and to understand him very well. This book is a very detailed study of the African religion, and we can call it the Bantu religion. And he takes the Agikuyu and the Akamba as the sample, and he really goes in detail to study them, and he discovers very interesting details that today are not talked about a lot. For example, he sees a lot of similarities between the ancient Israelites and the Agikuyu and the Akamba, and in fact in the book he goes ahead and he puts verses that correspond to some of the religious practices of these two communities, which I found to be very interesting, because a book that does that often is a book written by the people who consider themselves to be Bantu and to believe in Bantu religion. There are people you would expect to do that, or people who believe that the black people are the ancient Israelites, are the people. And these are people often who are, of course, thought of to be in the fringe, like they are not the mainstream, and very many people will dismiss them like that just knowledge that does not make sense. But when you find such linking of the biblical verses with interpretation of his understanding of what the Akikuyu and the Akamba used to do, then that becomes very, very, very interesting. Those are my random thoughts.